Lauren trembled as she watched the camera footage. Hannah, the nanny she trusted, was injecting a strange liquid into baby Oliver's bottle, her eyes cold like a killer's. Across the room, Cooper growled, claws shredding the kennel floor, his eyes blazing with desperate fury. If Cooper hadn't been there that night, Oliver might never have woken up. Subscribe now to watch our next dramatic, haunting, and emotional episodes. The sun sank low behind the towering pines that framed the Miller property, casting long, slanted rays of gold through the dense forest canopy. From above, the sprawling cedar-shingled house appeared to glow, each window reflecting the fading light like silent eyes watching the forest breathe. A gravel driveway curved up to the front steps, flanked by banks of hydrangeas heavy with pale blooms. Wind rustled the pine needles in soft whispers that seemed to echo against the darkening sky. Inside the house exhaled a warmth that belied its isolation. Smooth oak floors gleamed beneath Lauren's careful polish. She moved from room to room with measured grace, her tailored navy slacks brushing quietly against her ankles as she carried a stack of files from the kitchen island to her office. Her dark hair, pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, swung forward each time she bent to pick up a stray toy or reorganize the invoices spread across the dining table. Lauren Miller, 34, senior litigation counsel at one of Boston's most prestigious firms, had learned early that perfection was a currency more valuable than gold. The kitchen counters gleamed with disciplined order. Even the fruit bowl held apples turned with their stems upright. From her earliest internships to her current high-stakes real estate arbitration cases, her colleagues admired her relentless poise almost as much as they feared it. Tonight, however, that professional detachment softened. As she passed the living room, her eyes caught on the small bassinet stationed near the fireplace. Inside, tiny Oliver Miller, just 6 weeks old, slept with his fist curled beside his cheek, lashes fanned against translucent skin. Lauren paused, feeling the subtle shift in her chest that had begun the day she learned he was coming. An ache made of protectiveness, fear, and something wordless that expanded every time she looked at him. She knelt beside the bassinet, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The warmth of his skin against her lips made her stomach flip with a protective ferocity that startled her each time. She inhaled the sweet, milky scent that rose from his little cotton sleepsuit, memorizing the damp curls that clung to his temple. The whir of the baby monitor on the mantel was the only sound between them. From the kitchen, a low thump and the jangling rattle of metal tags announced another presence. Cooper shuffled into view, nails ticking lightly across the hardwood as he entered the living room and lowered his nose toward the bassinet. His massive head hovered inches above Oliver's chest, nostrils flaring softly as he checked for the rise and fall of tiny lungs. Satisfied, he let out a long sigh that ruffled the blanket before lowering his hips to the floor with a grunt. "Good boy, Coop," Lauren whispered. She reached out to scratch behind his ears, feeling the familiar knots of old scars beneath his golden fur. His eyes closed under her touch, but his ears twitched at each creak of the floorboards upstairs. Even in rest, Cooper was a sentinel. At 11 years old, Cooper moved more slowly than he once had. Gray salted the fur around his muzzle and paws, and arthritis in his left hip made him hesitate before leaping onto the couch. But what age stole from his limbs, it sharpened in his instincts. Lauren often told David that Cooper could read her mood better than any human, an unspoken truth that went beyond mere training. 3 years earlier, Cooper had saved her life. She had been 6 months pregnant, her belly heavy with Oliver, when she slipped on the top stair while rushing to answer a work call. In that half-second of flight, terror clamped her lungs so tightly she couldn't even scream. But Cooper, lounging at the foot of the staircase, lunged up with a force that belied his age. He caught her shoulder with his chest, knocking her sideways against the banister and cushioning the impact. Lauren still remembered the way his ribs had felt under her palm, the way his chest heaved as he steadied her, the unblinking amber gaze fixed on hers as if to say, "I've got you." He had kept her and Oliver safe that day. Since then, his loyalty had never wavered. From upstairs came the sound of running water and David's humming. Lauren rose, smoothing a hand over Cooper's head before stepping into the kitchen. The smell of roasted garlic and thyme drifted from the oven where David's herb chicken browned under the broiler. She leaned against the counter and watched him through the pass-through window as he filled Oliver's baby tub in the ensuite bathroom. David Miller, 36. Civil engineer with a specialty in bridge design, stood barefoot on the slate tiles. Sleeves rolled past his elbows as he adjusted the water temperature with one hand and tested it with the other. His hair, once a uniform walnut brown, showed streaks of silver at the temples. There was a confidence in his posture, an easy strength built from years of climbing steel beams and inspecting rivets high above riverbeds. Tonight, however, His movements were gentle, almost reverent, as he prepared to bathe his son. "You want the honors tonight?" he called over the rush of water. Lauren smiled, though exhaustion pulled at her skin. "You go ahead. He settles better with you after baths." "He settles with you any time," David countered, glancing back with a grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "He knows you're the soft touch," she teased. "He knows I'm the one who'll make him work for his dinner," spoken like a true lawyer. Their easy banter was punctuated by Oliver's muffled cry as David lifted him from the bassinet. Lauren listened, heart-thudding in that primal anxious rhythm only new mothers understand, until she heard David's low murmur of comfort and the baby's whimpers quieted into hiccuping sighs. She turned her attention back to the kitchen, setting the table for two, while Cooper settled himself by the sliding glass doors. Outside, the tree line thickened into a dark mass, the sunset now reduced to a faint orange glow on the horizon. The security lights around the porch flicked on with mechanical precision, casting the patio furniture in harsh white beams. As Lauren arranged the silverware headlights, curved up the driveway, sweeping across the windows in two bright arcs. Her brow furrowed. They weren't expecting anyone. The engine cut. A moment later, a sleek white Prius rolled to a quiet stop in front of the porch. The driver's door opened, and a young woman stepped out. She wore a light beige cardigan over a floral print dress that skimmed just above her knees. Her hair, a pale honey blonde, was twisted into a low bun, secured with a tortoiseshell clip. She moved with the confident poise of someone used to entering unfamiliar homes. Cooper's ears flattened. A low, vibrating growl rolled through his chest. He rose stiffly to his feet, nails clicking sharply against the wood as he moved toward the door, his body held rigid and tail low. Lauren wiped her hands on her apron and went to open the door. "Cooper, hush," she murmured. But the dog's growl deepened, vibrating through the floor into her slippers. The woman paused on the porch, shifting the strap of her leather tote bag higher on her shoulder. She smiled. A perfectly polite practice smile that creased her cheeks but didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes, Lauren noticed, were an icy blue, nearly gray in the twilight. Cool, assessing and flicking past Lauren's face to scan the interior before settling briefly coldly on Cooper. "Hi there," she said, her voice a pleasant alto, with just the faintest trace of an indeterminate southern lilt. "I'm Hannah, from Bright Horizons Nanny Agency. We spoke on the phone this morning." Lauren's stomach tightened with fleeting guilt. Between conference calls and a filing deadline, she had almost forgotten they had arranged for an evening meet and greet before hiring a full-time nanny. "Yes, of course," she said quickly, stepping aside. "Please come in. Sorry about the chaos, we're still figuring out the bedtime routine." "No worries at all," Hannah replied smoothly, her smile sharpening just a fraction as she stepped into the foyer. She glanced at Cooper, whose teeth bared in a silent snarl. Lauren placed a restraining hand on his collar. "Cooper, enough. He's gorgeous," Hannah said lightly, though her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Fear, distaste, annoyance. Lauren couldn't pin it down before it vanished behind another bright smile. "Golden retriever?" "Yeah," Lauren said, scratching behind Cooper's ears in an attempt to calm him. "He's protective, especially with the baby." "Oh, I understand." Hannah crouched down, reaching out her hand palm down toward Cooper. Her movement was graceful, deliberate. But Cooper didn't sniff her fingers. He stood rooted, hackles raised, a guttural rumble rising from his throat as his gaze locked onto her face. With a laser focus, Hannah straightened her smile, unwavering, but her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. She brushed an invisible speck of lint from her dress and turned to Lauren with a small laugh. "Maybe he just needs time to get used to me." "Probably," Lauren said, though her pulse thudded with unease. Cooper had never reacted this way to anyone before. Not neighbors, not delivery drivers, not the cleaning crew. Only once years ago had he growled like this when a contractor working in their basement turned out to have a long record of burglary arrests. "I brought my portfolio and certifications," Hannah said, producing a slim leather folder from her tote. "And some references you can call. I've also prepared a short daily activity plan draft based on Oliver's age and milestones." Lauren exhaled a shaky breath, forcing herself to focus. They needed childcare. Her maternity leave was nearing its end, and David's firm was pressuring him to accept a new project in Seattle that would require bi-weekly travel. Hannah's poised professionalism was exactly what they needed. As Hannah spoke, her voice low and calm, Cooper shifted closer to Lauren's leg, pressing his massive body protectively against her hip. His gaze never wavered from Hannah's face, and though his growl subsided to a deep chest hum, his tail remained low and stiff, the tip twitching with unease. Lauren forced herself to smile, extending her hand. "Welcome to our home, Hannah. Let's sit down and talk through your schedule and expectations." But as Hannah's cool, smooth fingers closed around hers, Lauren felt the faintest tremor pass from Hannah's palm into her own, a tremor that felt deliberate, almost like a silent warning. Behind her, Cooper's growl rumbled low, vibrating through the quiet living room as the sun finally disappeared behind the forest and darkness settled over the house like a waiting hand. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring cold chamomile tea as Hannah's voice floated softly from the nursery upstairs. The nanny's words rose and fell in a sing-song cadence, punctuated by Oliver's occasional gurgle. Despite the calm, a knot of unease coiled tighter in Lauren's stomach with each passing minute. Cooper lay sprawled at her feet, his massive head resting atop his paws. His ears twitched forward with every noise from the monitor balanced beside Lauren's laptop. The baby monitor cast a dull white glow across the table, illuminating the silent courtroom files strewn before her. She had tried for the last half hour to focus on deposition notes, but her attention kept snagging on the monitor's flickering screen. On it, Hannah moved gracefully around the nursery, adjusting the blackout curtains, folding Oliver's soft muslin blankets into precise squares. Occasionally, she paused to peer down into the crib, smiling and murmuring something inaudible. Lauren couldn't place why the sight unsettled her. Hannah's movements were practiced, competent, even gentle. And yet, a sharp guttural growl rolled through Cooper's chest. Lauren startled, sloshing tea over the rim of her mug. She reached down to soothe him, but his shoulders were rigid beneath her palm muscles quivering as he stared unblinking at the monitor. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Her gaze followed his to the screen, just as Hannah bent over the crib. Oliver's tiny fists waved sleepily, his eyes half-lidded with drowsy contentment. Hannah chuckled softly, then straightened and turned toward the doorway, disappearing off-screen. Moments later, Lauren heard her descending the stairs. Cooper rose before Hannah reached the landing, his nails ticking sharply on the hardwood as he positioned himself squarely in front of the bottom step. His tail stood stiff hackles rippling beneath his thick golden coat. When Hannah appeared in the hallway, a rolled swaddle blanket balanced atop a pile of laundry in her arms, his growl deepened to a rumble that vibrated the air around them. "Hey there, big guy," Hannah crooned, her voice syrupy smooth. She descended the final step and paused in front of Cooper. "No need for all that noise." Cooper bared his teeth in a silent snarl. Hannah's smile didn't waver. Slowly, deliberately, she crouched down until her eyes were level with his. Her free hand reached out and brushed lightly along his collarbone fingers, slipping beneath his ruff to scratch his chest. The motion was gentle, rhythmic, almost affectionate. But when Lauren blinked and looked closer, she saw Hannah's thumb press hard into the tender flesh beneath Cooper's chin. He flinched, shifting his weight away, but didn't retreat. Hannah leaned in closer until her lips nearly brushed his ear. "You're not the only protector here," she whispered so low, Lauren barely caught it. Lauren's chest tightened. "Is everything okay?" she called from the kitchen, rising quickly. Hannah turned her smile, flicking back into place like a light switch. "All good," she sang out, straightening and patting Cooper's head lightly. "Just getting him used to me." "He's such a sweet old man, aren't you, Cooper?" Cooper's eyes tracked her as she moved into the laundry room. His body remained taut, ears pinned back against his skull. When Lauren reached his side, he leaned heavily against her thigh, his entire frame shuddering with tension. She sank her fingers into the thick fur at his neck, scratching gently. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Upstairs, Oliver's cries crackled through the monitor. Hannah's voice followed a low hum, rising into a lullaby that sounded almost mournful. Lauren glanced back at Cooper. His ears twitched forward at the sound, then flattened again, his tail thumping once against the floor in agitation. That night, dinner was a quiet affair. David recounted his project timeline, while Oliver dozed in his rocker beside the table. Cooper lay with his chin resting against the baby's tiny feet, his eyes flicking up to watch Hannah as she moved between kitchen and laundry room, wiping counters, drying dishes, folding bibs and towels into neat stacks. Each time she passed behind David's chair, Cooper's lip curled silently, revealing a glint of ivory fang. "She's efficient, huh?" David commented, gesturing with his fork toward the nanny as she loaded the dishwasher. "Maybe we should have hired help sooner. You'd have had an easier recovery." Lauren forced a small smile. "Yeah, maybe." Hannah straightened, catching Lauren's gaze across the kitchen. She smiled, and for a fleeting instant, Lauren saw it again. That glint of something colder, something calculating lurking beneath Hannah's placid expression. Later that evening, after Oliver's final feeding, Hannah approached Lauren in the living room. Cooper sat beside the couch, his head pressed firmly against Lauren's knee as she scrolled through work emails on her tablet. Hannah's perfume drifted ahead of her, a sweet vanilla that made Lauren's eyes water. "Oliver's down for the night," Hannah announced softly. "He fell asleep almost as soon as I rocked him." Lauren glanced up. "Thank you, Hannah. You're settling in well." Hannah's smile widened. "It's easy with a good baby. Some scream for hours. Oliver's an angel." Lauren closed her tablet and rubbed her temples. Her headache pulsed just beneath her skull. "I'm going to shower. Will you be okay down here for a bit?" "Of course," Hannah replied. She perched gracefully on the armchair near the window, folding her legs beneath her. Cooper's eyes followed Lauren as she crossed the living room toward the stairs, his ears pricking forward when she disappeared around the corner. Steam fogged the master bathroom mirror as Lauren stood beneath the pounding spray, eyes closed, letting the hot water wash away the grit of exhaustion clinging to her skin. Her mind drifted back to Cooper's growl, the way Hannah had pressed her thumb into his throat. It could have been nothing. A firm scratch, a controlling touch. But something in the gesture unsettled her deeply. She dried herself quickly, slipping into cotton pajamas before padding back down the hallway. As she passed Oliver's room, she paused. The door was cracked open, shadows flickering across the soft gray walls from the motion nightlight shaped like a moon. She pushed the door open wider. Cooper sat in the middle of the nursery, his broad back blocking the crib. His ears were flat against his skull, and a guttural growl vibrated the quiet room. Hannah stood on the far side of the crib, her hands braced against the rail. She was leaning over Oliver, her hair falling in a silky curtain around her face. For a brief second, Lauren thought Hannah was kissing his forehead. A sweet maternal gesture. But then she heard it. Hannah's voice low and sharp, slicing through the darkness. "Sleep, you little brat," she hissed. "Just sleep." Oliver whimpered softly, the sound thin and frightened. Cooper's growl deepened, his tail thudding heavily against the carpet as his lips peeled back from his teeth. Hannah straightened abruptly, flipping her hair over her shoulder, her face shuddering back into pleasant composure as she spotted Lauren in the doorway. "Oh, hi," she said lightly, her voice a sing-song note that grated across Lauren's raw nerves. "Just checking his diaper before I head down." "He's fine." Lauren's throat tightened. "Okay, thank you." Hannah circled the crib, brushing past Cooper without touching him, and slipped out the door. Cooper remained where he was, his body blocking the crib, his eyes never leaving the spot where Hannah had stood. Lauren walked over and knelt beside him, scratching his neck. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy." Downstairs, Hannah's footsteps creaked across the floorboards as she moved toward the living room. Lauren followed, pausing at the top of the stairs when she heard her nanny's voice. Low, hushed, edged with urgency. "I told you it's fine," Hannah snapped. "No, they don't suspect anything. The wife is a pushover, and the husband's clueless. The only problem is the damn dog." Silence. Then Hannah laughed softly, a sound that made Lauren's scalp prickle. Yeah, I'll take care of it. Don't worry. Just stick to the plan." Lauren pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat hammer against her ribs. The baby monitor tucked into her robe pocket buzzed softly. Through it, she could hear the faint echo of Hannah's voice and the low, steady growl of Cooper vibrating in the nursery upstairs. She backed away from the stairwell, her pulse thundering in her ears. In the nursery, Cooper stood rigid beside Oliver's crib, his amber eyes fixed on the door as if daring anyone, anything, to cross his threshold again. Morning light spilled through the kitchen window in slanted bars, illuminating specks of flour that floated lazily above the countertop. Lauren moved mechanically, scooping oatmeal into Oliver's tiny silicone bowl, stirring in mashed banana with a distracted hand. Her gaze flicked repeatedly to the baby monitor perched near the sink, where Cooper's broad golden form stood sentry in the doorway of the nursery. From the monitor's tinny speaker came the rustle of sheets, the creak of floorboards, and Hannah's bright sing-song greeting. "Good morning, little man. Let's get you dressed so Mommy can see how handsome you look." Lauren strained to hear Oliver's coos in response, but Cooper's low, constant growl drowned out the softer sounds. She glanced at the time on the stove clock. 7:15 a.m. David was still upstairs shaving before his early sight inspection. The day had barely begun, and already that knot of dread had returned tightening beneath her ribcage until each breath felt shallow and jagged. From the monitor, Cooper's growl shifted to a deeper rumble. Hannah's voice dropped no longer sugar-sweet. "Move, you dumb mutt!" she hissed, the words slithering across the speaker like oil across water. "Get out of my way." Lauren stiffened. Before she could react, a muffled thud sounded. Cooper yelped, short, sharp cut off before it fully formed. The monitor's angle showed only the lower half of the nursery doorway, the edge of Oliver's crib. Cooper's splayed paws bracing against the hardwood. Hannah's legs moved past the camera's narrow field of view, quick and determined. She dropped the spoon into the oatmeal bowl with a soft splatter and strode toward the stairs, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Halfway up, David's footsteps thudded along the hallway above. He appeared at the landing tie, loose around his neck, still smoothing shaving cream from his jaw with a towel. "Everything okay?" he asked, brow furrowing as he saw her expression. "Hannah just kicked." "Cooper," Lauren blurted. The words felt hot on her tongue, burning with fury and disbelief. He was blocking her from Oliver's crib. I heard him yelp. David blinked, processing. She kicked him. "Yes?" Lauren pushed past him, her slippers sliding on the polished oak as she reached the nursery doorway. Inside, Hannah stood at the changing table, snapping Oliver's onesie closed with brisk efficiency. Her hair fell in a tidy rope over her shoulder, not a strand out of place. Cooper lay against the opposite wall chest, heaving front paw curled protectively over his nose. He looked up as Lauren entered, his eyes dark and wounded. Hannah turned with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller. I hope you don't mind. I went ahead and changed his diaper." He was soaked through. Lauren ignored the pleasantries. "Did you kick him?" Hannah's eyes widened, confusion etched delicately across her pretty features. "Kick him? Oh. Cooper. No, of course not. He startled when I moved past. I think my shoe must have brushed his paw. Poor old guy." David appeared behind Lauren, resting a warm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Babe, it was probably an accident." Lauren didn't take her eyes off Hannah. For a fleeting instant, the nanny's gaze hardened, flicking toward Cooper with a flicker of disgust before it softened again. She reached down, fingers brushing lightly along Oliver's cheek. "Your breakfast is ready downstairs, little man," she cooed. Cooper struggled to his feet as Hannah approached the crib, moving with effort. He positioned himself between her and the baby's shoulders, squared hackles rippling in a silent wave along his spine. His lips curled back from his teeth in a snarl so deep and primal it made Lauren's scalp prickle. "Cooper," David snapped, stepping forward. "Knock it off." Hannah froze, hand hovering above Oliver's chest. He's been like this since yesterday," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to convey fragile concern. "I don't know what I did to upset him. He's just being protective," Lauren said tightly. "Maybe you should give him some space." David sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Or maybe he's just getting old and unpredictable. He's never acted like this before, Lauren. If he's becoming aggressive, he's not aggressive." Lauren snapped sharper than she intended. Cooper's eyes flicked toward her ears, twitching at her tone. "He's warning us." About what David's voice held irritation, now fueled by fatigue and the weight of looming deadlines. "Hannah's done nothing but help since she got here. Maybe he's confused because she's new. Dogs are creatures of habit." Hannah's shoulders drooped, her expression sorrowful as she looked down at Cooper. "I really am trying to bond with him," she murmured. "I know how important he is to you." Lauren said nothing. Cooper's snarl subsided to a deep rumbling growl, but his body remained braced between Oliver and Hannah, tail stiff, hackles raised like bristled wire. David squeezed Lauren's arm. "Babe, I need to get going. Can we talk about this tonight?" She nodded numbly, though anger burned hot and tight in her chest. As he pressed a kiss to her cheek and ruffled Oliver's wispy curls, she watched Hannah out of the corner of her eye. The nanny's face softened as David passed her, eyes warm and grateful as she thanked him for the fresh towels he'd set aside in the laundry room. When he left, her gaze flicked back to Cooper, the warmth extinguished in an instant. "I'll feed Oliver," Lauren said abruptly, stepping forward to lift her son from the crib. Cooper backed away, only far enough to let her through, keeping his body between Hannah and the baby as she settled Oliver against her hip. Hannah clasped her hands in front of her apron, her smile serene. "I'll clean up his bottles from last night. Let me know if you need anything." Lauren carried Oliver to the rocking chair in the corner, feeling his warmth seep into her chest as he burrowed sleepily against her collarbone. Cooper followed, collapsing at her feet with a groan that rattled through his ribs. His tail curled tight against his flank, the tip thumping anxiously against the hardwood with each creak of the floorboards behind Hannah as she bustled about. She could hear Hannah humming softly in the adjoining bathroom, the melody low and tuneless. Each note grated across Lauren's frayed nerves, sharpening the dread already gnawing at her gut. Oliver whimpered and shifted in her arms, his small fists clenching around the collar of her robe. "It's okay, baby," she whispered against his downy hair. "Mommy's here." Cooper lifted his head and pressed his nose against Oliver's tiny foot, his warm breath puffing through the thin cotton of his pajamas. His eyes flicked up to meet Lauren's, and in their amber depths she saw something that made her stomach twist. Worry, yes, but also urgency. A silent plea she could not decipher. Downstairs, the clatter of dishes and running water filtered up through the vent. The normalcy of the domestic sounds felt jarringly out of sync with the tension coiled around her ribs like barbed wire. She pressed a kiss to Oliver's temple, inhaling the familiar milky scent of his skin, and let her tears fall soundlessly onto his soft hair. Later that afternoon, after Oliver's nap, Hannah carried him downstairs for tummy time on the living room rug. Cooper followed close behind, walking so tightly to her heel, his nose nearly brushed the hem of her jeans. Each time she paused, he shifted in front of her, blocking her path with his massive bulk. "Cooper, move!" Hannah ordered, her voice strained with forced patience. When he didn't budge, she muttered under her breath a string of words Lauren couldn't catch from across the room. Lauren sat at the dining table, laptop open, but forgotten, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. Cooper stood planted in front of the playmat, tail stiff, ears flat. His growl rumbled through the floorboards and into Lauren's slippers, vibrating up her legs until her teeth ached with the tension of it. Hannah shifted Oliver onto his stomach and gently patted his back. "There you go, handsome boy. Let's work those little muscles." Oliver gurgled softly, his head bobbing as he attempted to lift it, arms pushing weakly against the mat. Hannah clapped her hands softly, praise dripping from her voice like honey. "Good job, look at you." Cooper inched closer, lowering his massive head, until his nose hovered inches above Oliver's shoulder. His breath stirred the fine wisps of hair on the baby's neck. Hannah stiffened, shooting him a glare, before flicking her gaze back to Lauren with an apologetic smile. "He's just protective, I guess." Lauren swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in her throat. "He's never been like this with anyone before. Maybe he senses I'm nervous?" Hannah offered with a delicate shrug. "Dogs pick up on that," maybe Lauren whispered, though the words tasted like ash. Cooper let out a low huff. His ears pinned back as he shifted closer to Oliver. His flank brushed against Hannah's calf. She flinched, and with a swift movement sheathed in casual grace, nudged her foot sharply against his ribs. Cooper yelped, stumbling sideways, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the hardwood. Hannah Lauren's voice cracked across the room, sharp and hard as shattered glass. The nanny looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm so sorry. He startled me." "I didn't mean." Lauren stood so abruptly her chair screeched against the floor. Cooper slunk away, head low, tail tucked tight against his belly. He curled beside the coffee table, watching Hannah with eyes that burned dark and sad. "Maybe you should take a break," Lauren said tightly. "I'll finish his tummy time." Hannah bit her lip, nodding quickly. "Of course. I'll go prep bottles for the night feeds." As she bustled into the kitchen, David's words from that morning rang in Lauren's ears. Maybe he's just old. Maybe he's confused. But as she gathered Oliver into her arms, feeling the rapid flutter of his tiny heart against her chest, Cooper rose shakily and pressed his forehead to her knee. His eyes flicked to Hannah's retreating back, then up to Lauren again, filled with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Something was wrong. Deeply, irrevocably wrong. And for the first time since Hannah arrived, Lauren felt a cold, coiling certainty settle in her chest. Cooper wasn't confused. He was trying to warn them. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the living room in a relentless rhythm, each droplet splattering like frantic fingers against the glass. Wind howled through the surrounding forest, rattling pine branches against the eaves and sending hollow groans through the walls. The security lights flickered in and out as the storm clouds roiled overhead, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight into an early suffocating darkness. Lauren paced the kitchen, clutching her phone in one hand, absently scrolling through the latest work emails, though her eyes barely registered the words. Her other hand curled protectively around the mug of chamomile tea she'd brewed, but not touched its steam, long since faded into cold. Each time thunder rolled in the distance, Oliver stirred in his bassinet near the dining table, whimpering softly before settling again into uneasy sleep. David's text had come an hour earlier, just after he boarded his delayed flight to Seattle. "I'll call when I land. I love you both. Tell Coop to guard the house tonight." She had forced a smile at that, hearing David's teasing warmth behind the words, but as the storm deepened, darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. Her husband's absence settled around her shoulders like a wet wool blanket. Heavy, oppressive, cold. From the mudroom came the soft jingling of metal tags, followed by the scrape of nails across tile. Cooper appeared in the kitchen doorway. His fur darkened and clumped with rain, despite only having been outside briefly earlier. He patted forward, ears flat against his skull, amber eyes fixed intently on Lauren's face. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice brittle with tension. Thunder cracked again, shaking the window panes. Cooper flinched, then let out a low, keening whine that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. She set the mug down and moved to the back door, peering out into the darkness. The porch lights flickered uncertainly, illuminating the sheets of rain slanting sideways across the yard. Beyond the manicured lawn, the tree line loomed black and impenetrable. Cooper pressed his massive body against her thigh, vibrating with a nervous energy she could feel radiating from his bones. Lightning split the sky in a jagged electric scream. For a fleeting instant, the backyard lay exposed in stark, colorless clarity. Lauren's eyes flicked across the patio furniture, the stone path leading to the garage, the vegetable beds flattened by rain. Nothing moved except the wild thrash of shrubs in the wind. But Cooper began to growl, a deep, chest-rattling sound that rose into a low, mournful howl. The sound crawled along Lauren's skin like cold fingers. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs as she turned back to him. "What's out there, Coop?" she whispered. He didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the far left corner of the yard, where the kitchen jutted out in a small bay window near the herbs she'd planted that spring. The basil had died in the early frost, leaving behind brittle stalks that rattled with each gust of wind. Cooper's growl deepened. Then he threw back his head and let out a long, haunting howl that rose above the storm's fury, echoing into the trees with a note of desperate urgency. Oliver woke with a startled cry, flailing his small fists against his swaddle. Lauren rushed to scoop him up, cradling his trembling body against her chest. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, but her voice shook as badly as her hands. Cooper spun in a tight circle, nails skidding on the tile, then lunged toward the back door, barking in short, explosive bursts that made Oliver wail louder. He threw his weight against the doorframe, paws, scrabbling at the glass, his massive frame vibrating with frantic energy. Lauren swallowed against the nausea rising in her throat. She glanced at her phone on the counter. No service. The storm had knocked out the signal again. Thunder boomed so close the floor vibrated beneath her bare feet. "Okay," she whispered to herself, shifting Oliver higher on her hip. Okay, we'll check, just to be sure." She tucked Oliver back into his bassinet, ignoring his watery cries as she hurried to the mudroom. The heavy-duty flashlight sat in its cradle beside the laundry sink. She flicked it on, relief flooding her chest when the beam cut through the darkness like a sword. Cooper pressed against the back door, his nose smearing frantic streaks across the glass as he barked, hackles raised so high they bristled like porcupine quills. "Stay," Lauren commanded, her voice quavering. She slipped on her raincoat, zipped it to her chin, and stepped into her rubber boots. Cooper whined in protest but obeyed. She unlocked the deadbolt and stepped outside. Instantly, the wind slapped her face with cold rain, flattening her hair against her scalp and seeping icy fingers down the back of her coat. She shivered violently but forced herself forward, the flashlight beam trembling as her hands shook. "Hello," she called, her voice swallowed by the roar of rain against the trees. "Is someone out here?" Lightning flared again, illuminating the sodden yard in stark monochrome. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted to the herb beds, then the garden gate swinging wildly on its hinges. Beyond it lay the tree line, an undulating wall of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own hidden life. "Hello," she called again, weaker this time. Cooper's barking rose in pitch, almost frantic now, the sound muffled by the closed door behind her. Lauren's flashlight flicked across the patio, the rain-smudged stone glistening like slick marble. She moved slowly along the house's rear wall, heart hammering so hard she felt lightheaded. Water poured from the gutters in relentless sheets, splashing against her boots with every step. She reached the kitchen bay window and paused, wiping rain from her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Her flashlight flicked across the pane and stopped. A streak of dark red curved down the glass, trailing into a small spatter on the sill. It was thin, watery from the rain, but unmistakable. Blood. Lauren's breath caught on a sharp sob. For a moment, the world narrowed to the pounding of her pulse and the white-hot panic searing through her chest. She lifted the flashlight higher, pressing closer to the window, despite the cold spray of rain in her face. Another droplet of crimson slid down the glass, mingling with the rivulets of rain and disappearing into the shadows below the sill. She stumbled back, knees, weak bile rising in her throat. Behind her, the back door rattled in its frame as Cooper hurled himself against it, barking so violently she feared he'd break the glass. Lauren spun flashlight beams slicing through the darkness toward the trees. The underbrush thrashed in the wind, black shapes twisting and shifting in the shadows. Rain hammered her hood, seeping cold through her coat and into her bones. She forced her legs to move, half running back to the door. Cooper's frantic eyes locked on hers as she fumbled with the knob, nearly dropping the flashlight in her trembling hands. The moment the door swung open, Cooper exploded outside, muscles bunching as he lunged into the storm. He circled the yard in tight, agitated loops, nose low to the ground, barking sharply into the darkness beyond the fence. Lauren collapsed to her knees, just inside the mudroom, gasping for breath, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. Thunder boomed directly overhead, shaking the house. Oliver's thin, desperate cries floated from the kitchen, slicing through her panic like a knife. She forced herself upright and staggered back into the kitchen, scooping Oliver into her arms. His face was red and scrunched with terror, his tiny body trembling in her embrace. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, rocking him against her chest as tears spilled hot and silent down her cheeks. "It's okay. Mommy's here." Outside, Cooper's barking grew louder, sharper, filled with a note of desperate warning. Lauren grabbed her phone from the counter, her thumb shaking as she dialed 911. The call connected on the second ring, the operator's calm voice almost disorienting amidst the chaos. 911, what's your emergency? There's blood on my window." Lauren gasped, clutching Oliver tighter. "My dog is going crazy. My husband's out of town. Please, I think someone's out there." "Stay calm, ma'am. Is your door locked?" Yes, but stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Do not go outside again." Lauren sobbed, sinking to the floor beside the bassinet. Oliver's cries faded into hiccuping whimpers as she rocked him, her eyes locked on the kitchen window where the rain blurred everything into shifting shadows. Cooper's barking rose and fell, echoing through the storm like a siren. Minutes passed in agonizing slowness before headlights flashed across the windows. 2 patrol cars pulled into the driveway, their red and blue lights strobing against the kitchen walls. Lauren pressed her forehead to Oliver's breathing in his warmth as relief weakened her limbs. Cooper barked twice more, then fell silent. Lauren heard his nails scrabble against the back porch as he returned to the door. Moments later, heavy footsteps pounded up the front walk, and a firm knock rattled the door. "Ma'am, police?" She hurried to let them in her knees, nearly buckling with relief as 2 uniformed officers stepped into the foyer, shaking rain from their hats. Cooper slipped in behind them, his fur soaked and plastered to his ribs, eyes wild and frightened. Lauren poured out the story in breathless fragments, the blood, the barking, the shadowed trees. One officer nodded grimly and stepped back outside with Cooper at his heel, while the other remained with her, scanning each window with narrowed eyes. 15 minutes later, they returned. Rain dripped steadily from the brim of the officer's hat. "We didn't find anyone," he said, his voice gentle but tinged with practiced detachment. "No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Probably an injured animal deer, maybe brushed against your window in the storm." Lauren nodded numbly, hugging Oliver closer as the baby drifted back into exhausted sleep. The officer hesitated, then added, "Keep your doors locked tonight. And ma'am, that's a good dog you've got there." After they left, silence pressed heavy against the walls, broken only by the ticking of rain against the windows, and Cooper's ragged breathing as he lay stretched across the back door, his body a living barricade between the family he guarded and the darkness outside. Lauren sat beside him for a long time, listening to the storm rage around them, feeling the thunder shake the floor beneath her. She reached out and rested her hand on his massive head, her fingers sinking into his soaked fur. He turned to look at her eyes, dark and solemn, as if to say, "This isn't over." And deep in her chest, she believed him. Morning crept into the house reluctantly, gray light filtering through the shears to lay pale stripes across the nursery floor. The storm had passed overnight, leaving behind a silence so dense it pressed against the windows like fog. Outside, the forest dripped with rain, the wet pine trunks dark as obsidian columns rising into the mist. Lauren sat cross-legged on the nursery rug, her laptop balanced on her knees, headphones clamped over her ears. Her eyes burned with exhaustion as footage flickered across the screen. Hours of silent video from the baby monitor saved automatically to the cloud. Most showed Oliver sleeping fitfully, shifting under his blanket as the night wore on. But Lauren watched every second, scanning for shadows, for movements, for flickers of something that shouldn't be there. Behind her, Cooper lay curled against the base of Oliver's crib, his massive golden form blocking the crib's opening entirely. Every so often, he lifted his head and pressed his nose between the slats, sniffing softly before settling with a weary groan. At 6:15 a.m., the nursery door creaked open in the video. Hannah entered wearing her usual pale pink cardigan and soft ballet flats. Her hair was twisted into a neat low bun at the nape of her neck. She moved soundlessly to the crib, peering down at Oliver, then reaching in to adjust his blanket. Lauren froze the footage, leaning closer to the screen. Hannah's lips moved as she tucked the blanket under Oliver's chin. For a moment, Lauren thought she was singing. A morning greeting, perhaps, or a nursery rhyme. But as she scrubbed backward and raised the volume, a hiss of static filled her headphones, followed by Hannah's voice, low and tight. "Useless little thing," she whispered. "Can't even sleep through the night." Lauren's pulse hammered against her ribs, nausea rising hot and fast in her throat. She watched Hannah straighten smooth her cardigan and smile brightly toward the crib before turning away. She slammed the laptop shut, ripping off the headphones. The nursery spun around her for a moment as she struggled to catch her breath. Oliver stirred in his crib, his tiny face scrunching into a sleepy frown. Cooper whined softly, pressing closer to the crib until his flank nudged the wooden slats. "Good boy," Lauren whispered, reaching out to stroke his head with trembling fingers. "Good boy." She stood slowly, her knees popping in protest after hours folded on the floor. The hallway beyond the nursery was silent, the house hushed in its early morning calm. She carried the laptop to her bedroom and set it on the dresser, fingers trembling as she reopened the footage. Frame by frame, she scanned every moment from midnight to dawn, documenting each instance where Hannah's face flickered from placid professionalism to something harder, sharper, something almost contemptuous. Downstairs, the kettle clicked off with a hollow metallic pop. Lauren startled at the sound, her heart skipping painfully in her chest. She exhaled shakily and closed the laptop again. Footsteps padded along the hallway below. A soft humming drifted up the stairs, a tuneless melody she'd come to dread. She found Hannah in the kitchen pouring boiling water over a tea bag, steam curling around her face like ghostly fingers. When she saw Lauren, her eyes widened in pleasant surprise. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," she said brightly. "Rough night." Lauren swallowed the acid rising in her throat and forced a tight smile. "Storm kept me up." "Oh, I can imagine." Hannah's tone was soothing, sympathetic. Poor Cooper was howling all night. He must be exhausted, as if summoned. Cooper's nails clicked on the tile behind Lauren. He entered the kitchen, stiff-legged hackles, raised amber eyes locked on Hannah with naked hostility. His lips curled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. Hannah's smile faltered for half a second, flickering like a dying candle. Then she chuckled softly and reached for the box of dog biscuits on the counter. "Who's a good boy?" she cooed, shaking the box enticingly. Cooper didn't move. His growl rumbled low and constant, vibrating through the kitchen floor. Hannah shrugged and set the biscuits back down. "Suit yourself," she said lightly. But as she passed Lauren, her lips barely parted. She muttered under her breath, "Stupid, filthy mutt." The words were so soft, Lauren almost thought she imagined them. Almost. But the venom in Hannah's voice was unmistakable, slicing through the domestic quiet with a sharp glinting edge. Lauren's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched Hannah walk away, her pale flat silent on the hardwood as she disappeared into the laundry room. Cooper inched closer to Lauren, pressing his massive body against her legs, his head-bowed eyes still locked on the empty doorway. She sank to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. He whined softly and leaned into her embrace, his tail sweeping the floor in a slow, worried rhythm. "I know, baby," she whispered into his fur. "I know. We'll fix this." Later that morning, while Hannah bathed Oliver upstairs, Lauren sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open in front of her. She scrolled through hidden camera listings with numb fingers, her heart thudding in her throat with each discreet advertisement. Mini cam disguised as alarm clock. Wireless nanny cam in smoke detector casing. Motion-activated teddy bear camera. She settled on 2 models with night vision and same-day delivery. One would go in the nursery, the other in the living room where Hannah spent long afternoons rocking Oliver to sleep. When the order confirmation arrived in her inbox, her shoulders sagged with a relief so intense it made her eyes sting. Cooper rested his chin on her bare foot, his body warm and solid against her calf. She reached down and scratched his ears. "Good boy," she murmured. Upstairs, Oliver's cry cut through the quiet. A sharp, startled wail that ended abruptly. Lauren froze her breath, catching painfully in her throat. The baby monitor beside her laptop remained silent. Hannah had turned it off again. Panic clawed up her chest as she stood abruptly, the bar stool scraping against the tile. Cooper leapt to his feet beside her, his ears flattened, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Lauren took the stairs 2 at a time, Cooper thundering after her. She nearly collided with Hannah in the hallway outside the nursery. The nanny's cheeks were flushed, her hair damp with steam from the bathroom. "Oh, you startled me." Hannah laughed breathlessly, shifting Oliver higher against her hip. The baby's eyes were glassy, unfocused, his limbs limp. "What happened?" Lauren demanded, her voice shaking. "He slipped a little in the tub," Hannah replied smoothly, patting Oliver's back. "Just scared himself. He's fine now." Lauren reached for him, but Hannah turned slightly out of her reach, smiling sweetly. "Why don't you go finish your coffee? I'll bring him down after he's dressed." Cooper lunged forward, snapping his jaws just inches from Hannah's thigh. The nanny flinched back with a sharp gasp, clutching Oliver tighter. "Jesus, get him away from me." "Cooper, no," Lauren snapped, grabbing his collar. But her heart wasn't in the reprimand. Beneath her anger burned a searing, righteous fear. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, her lower lip trembling. "I'm trying so hard with him," she whispered, pressing her cheek against Oliver's damp hair. "I don't know why he hates me so much." Lauren didn't reply. She pulled Cooper back down the hallway, his growl reverberating through his chest and into her palm. When she glanced over her shoulder, Hannah was watching them go, her expression blank eyes dark and flat as river stones. That night after Hannah left, Lauren unpacked the hidden cameras. Her hands trembled as she peeled the adhesive backing and pressed one into place above the nursery dresser, angled toward the crib and changing table. Cooper sat in the doorway, watching her silently, his tail thudding the floor in slow, anxious beats. "Good boy," she whispered, scratching his head as she passed. "We're almost there." She placed the second camera in the living room bookshelf, nestled between hardcover law journals and dusty photo albums. Its tiny lens blinked once, then stilled, blending seamlessly with the shadows. When David called from Seattle, she told him everything in clipped, quiet words. The blood on the window. Cooper's growling Hannah's muttered insults. He sighed heavily, the line crackling with poor reception. "Babe, you've barely slept in days," he said gently. "I think you're reading too much into this. She's been great with Oliver." "David, I'm not imagining this." Her voice cracked ragged with exhaustion. "Something's wrong." "Okay," he relented softly. "Okay, I trust you. Just don't do anything drastic until I get home, all right?" She didn't promise. Because in her bones, in the place deep inside where truth resonated without words, she knew. Cooper wasn't the problem. Hannah was, and she would prove it, no matter what it took. Outside the nursery window, the forest exhaled in the rising night wind. Cooper sat beside Oliver's crib, his ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on the darkened treetops beyond the glass. Watching, waiting, guarding, as he always had, as he always would. The morning unfolded with an eerie quiet that seeped into the corners of the house like a lingering fog. Sunlight slanted through the nursery curtains in thin, watery beams, catching on drifting motes of dust. Lauren sat cross-legged in the living room laptop, balanced on her thighs, heart thudding so violently it shook the screen where it rested against her knees. The footage loaded slowly, buffering frame by agonizing frame. Her fingers drummed against the keyboard as she fast-forwarded through the early morning hours. Hannah entering the nursery at dawn, cooing over Oliver with her practiced, sugar-sweet smile. Lauren clenched her jaw at the sight of it, bile rising hot in her throat. Beside her, Cooper lay stretched out on the rug, head resting on his front paws. His tail thumped once in agitation. Each time, Hannah's voice drifted faintly from the laptop speakers. When the timeline marker reached 10:06 a.m., Lauren froze the footage, her pulse hammering in her ears. Hannah sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, Oliver nestled in the crook of her arm. In her other hand, she held his bottle. Lauren squinted at the footage, frowning. The bottle's contents seemed off. Thicker, somehow cloudy, and tinted faintly yellow. She scrubbed backward, watching Hannah unscrew the cap and reach into her pocket. Her movements were quick, practiced. She glanced toward the crib camera, only once a flicker of wary calculation in her eyes. Then she poured something from a small amber bottle into the milk, swirling it with deft efficiency before screwing the nipple back on. Lauren's vision tunneled. The room seemed to tilt around her as nausea flooded her chest. On the footage, Hannah lifted the bottle to Oliver's mouth, her fingers stroking his cheek gently as he latched on and began to drink. Within minutes, his eyelids drooped. His small hands, which had been fisting and curling against her sweater, fell limp at his sides. Lauren scrubbed forward in 10-second increments, eyes locked on the rise and fall of his chest. Each breath came slower, shallower, until minutes passed between them. Hannah tucked the bottle aside and shifted him onto her lap, cradling his head in the crook of her elbow. She smiled down at him with dreamy fondness, humming softly as his chest fluttered weakly beneath his onesie. On the floor, Cooper growled. The sound was so low it vibrated against Lauren's ankles. She glanced at him, tears blurring her vision. His hackles were raised, ears pinned flat against his skull teeth, bared in a silent snarl. "I know," she whispered, voice ragged. "I know." She clicked the volume icon and turned it up, wincing as static hissed through the speakers. Hannah's humming emerged, soft and tuneless, weaving around words, murmured so quietly Lauren had to lean closer to decipher them. "Such a quiet little boy now," Hannah crooned, brushing Oliver's hair back from his clammy forehead. "So sweet when you sleep. So easy." The room spun again. Lauren clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling the scream clawing up her throat. On the footage, Hannah shifted her free hand, dipping into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out the amber bottle and held it up, squinting at the label before shaking it slightly. Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile as she tucked it away again. Cooper lunged to his feet, pacing in frantic circles around the living room. He trotted to the front door, nails clicking on the tile, then back to Lauren, bumping her elbow with his nose. His eyes were wild with panic breath, coming in ragged pants. On screen, Hannah rose smoothly from the nursery floor, settling Oliver in his crib with gentle, meticulous care. She tucked the blanket under his chin and stroked his cheek with the back of her finger. "Sleep tight, little prince," she whispered. "You won't even know I'm gone." Then she turned smiling brightly at the camera and left the room. Lauren's vision blurred with tears. She scrubbed forward again. Minutes passed. Oliver didn't stir. His chest rose and fell in slow, frighteningly shallow movements. His tiny lips parted around silent, ragged breaths. "God!" she gasped, pressing her fists against her mouth. "God, no!" Cooper let out a sharp, desperate bark that shattered the silence. He lunged toward the mudroom door, pawing at the handle with frantic determination. His tail whipped from side to side in agitation, nails scrabbling against the wood. Lauren forced herself to her feet and staggered down the hall to the mudroom laptop clutched against her chest. The hidden camera footage switched to the living room angle as Hannah moved through the space, gathering small items into a tote bag. Oliver's silver rattle, a stack of folded onesies from the laundry basket, Lauren's wallet from the console table. She moved with eerie calm, humming that same tuneless lullaby as she worked. From the crate in this corner, Cooper barked and snarled, throwing his weight against the metal bars so violently, the entire cage rattled against the tile. The footage showed his teeth bared in primal fury, foam flecking his jowls as he clawed at the latch with bloody determination. Hannah didn't flinch. She merely glanced over her shoulder with an exasperated sigh, crossing the room to kneel in front of the crate. "Shh," she crooned, her voice dripping with contempt. "Stupid mutt. No one's listening to you." She rapped her knuckles sharply against the crate, and Cooper lunged forward, slamming his body into the door so hard the metal bent with a shriek of strained hinges. Hannah flinched back, eyes narrowing to hard slits, before she turned away, wiping her hands on her cardigan as if they'd been soiled. Lauren watched in frozen horror as Hannah moved to the entryway, slipping on her shoes and tucking the tote bag under her arm. She checked herself in the mirror, smoothing her hair and dabbing concealer under one eye where dark circles bloomed. Then she slipped out the front door, leaving the house silent, except for the sound of Cooper's frantic barking and Oliver's slow, labored breaths. "God!" Lauren sobbed, clapping a trembling hand over her mouth. "Oh, God." She ran to the nursery, heart slamming against her ribs so hard it felt like it might crack them open. Cooper bounded after her, nails skidding on the hardwood as he slid into the room ahead of her. He lunged for the crib, placing his massive paws against the rail and thrusting his nose down to Oliver's chest, sniffing frantically. Lauren stumbled forward and scooped Oliver into her arms. His body was limp, his head lolling against her shoulder. His skin felt clammy and cold through his onesie. Panic surged through her chest, white-hot and searing. "Come on, baby," she gasped, patting his back with trembling fingers. "Wake up for Mommy. Please, please." His eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. His chest rose in another shallow, stuttering breath. Cooper let out a low, desperate whine, pressing his nose against Oliver's leg. Lauren grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her thumb slipping on the glass screen, slick with sweat and tears. 911, what is your emergency?" "My baby," she sobbed, sinking to her knees on the nursery floor. "He's not breathing right. Please, please hurry." "Ma'am, stay calm. Is he conscious?" "No," she gasped, rocking him against her chest. "He's breathing, but it's slow. I think his nanny poisoned him." There was a brief pause on the line. "Emergency services are on the way. Stay with me, ma'am. Can you tell me what he was given?" "I don't know." She choked out, eyes blurring with tears as she pressed her cheek against Oliver's clammy forehead. "Please, please hurry." Cooper let out a bark so sharp it made her flinch. He spun and bolted from the nursery, nails thundering down the hallway. Lauren heard him crashing against the front door, barking furiously, the sound echoing through the silent house. She rocked Oliver gently, her tears falling hot and silent onto his still pale face. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please hold on." Outside, Cooper's barking rose to a fever pitch, punctuated by deep, chest-rattling growls. Through the baby monitor, which she'd left on the dresser, Lauren heard the faint squeal of tires on wet pavement as the paramedics arrived, their sirens silent in the early morning calm. The house door burst open moments later, and boots pounded down the hallway. Paramedics flooded the nursery, moving with swift, efficient urgency. Lauren stepped back, clutching Cooper's collar as the EMTs placed a tiny oxygen mask over Oliver's face and checked his pulse with quick, practiced fingers. "He's bradycardic," one muttered, voice low but tight with concern. "We need to move." They bundled him into a portable cot, hooking up monitors with rapid precision. Lauren followed them down the hallway, in a daze, her legs weak and trembling beneath her. Cooper pressed against her hip, with each step, his body a warm, solid barrier between her and the spinning chaos of the world. "Ma'am, you'll need to ride up front," one of the paramedics called over his shoulder as they loaded Oliver into the ambulance. "Do you know what he ingested?" "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I have footage." She gave him something. "We'll notify police," the medic replied. "Right now, focus on him." Lauren climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her phone against her chest. Behind her, Oliver lay on the gurney, so small and still beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The engine roared to life, sirens screaming as they pulled away from the curb. Through the ambulance window, Lauren saw Cooper standing on the porch, rain dripping from his golden fur eyes locked on the flashing lights as they disappeared into the dawn. She pressed her palm to the glass, a sob tearing from her chest. "Good boy," she whispered, though he could not hear her over the wail of the sirens. "Good boy. I'll come back for you." And as the ambulance tore down the deserted road, carrying them toward an uncertain horizon, Lauren clung to that silent promise. She would come back. And when she did, Cooper would be waiting, watching, guarding, as he always had. The third night fell heavy over the forest, blanketing the Miller estate in a suffocating quiet, broken only by the sighing wind through the pine tops. The moon hung behind a gauze of thin cloud, pale and distant, casting a ghostly light over the yard. Inside the house, shadows pooled in corners, long and black, and shifting with each flicker of the hallway nightlight. Cooper lay in his crate, eyes wide open, chest heaving with ragged, shallow breaths. His golden fur bristled along his spine, ears pinned tight against his skull. For hours he had paced and turned and clawed at the metal door until his paws bled, leaving dark smears across the plastic tray beneath him. Now he sat perfectly still, head tilted, listening. Upstairs the floorboards creaked softly. A hush almost imperceptible to human ears. But Cooper heard it. He heard every stealthy step, every soft whisper of fabric brushing against walls, every gentle squeak of Oliver's crib as the baby stirred, then settled back into an unnatural drugged sleep, a low guttural growl built in Cooper's chest, vibrating through his ribs. His nostrils flared, catching a scent that filled his mouth with bitterness. Chemical. Wrong. Predator. The lock on the crate rattled as he lunged forward, slamming his full weight against the metal door. The screws anchoring the crate to the wall groaned and shifted with a sharp metallic twang. Again. Again. His paws slipped in the smear of his own blood as he threw himself forward with a snarl that shook his entire body. Upstairs, Hannah moved silently across the nursery. Her pale pink sweater glowed dimly in the moonlight, slanting through the curtains. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, framing her face in dark gold waves. She leaned over Oliver's crib, watching his chest rise and fall with long, uneven pauses. "Sleep, little prince," she whispered, her voice threaded with a breathless, trembling excitement. "Sleep deep." She slid her hand under the mattress, feeling for the small metal cash box Lauren kept hidden there. Her fingers curled around it, pulling it free with shaking urgency. She set it on the rocking chair, then reached for her tote bag on the floor, her movements fast practiced, trembling with adrenaline. From the crate downstairs came the sound of metal wrenching against metal, a shriek that cut through the silence like a blade. Hannah froze her eyes, flicking to the baby monitor screen, where the living room camera feed showed only darkness and the empty crate door swinging open. She snatched up Oliver, clutching him against her chest as her breathing quickened to ragged gasps. "No." She hissed, her eyes darting to the nursery door. "No, no, no." Cooper tore up the staircase, his claws gouging deep into the hardwood with each lunging stride. His massive frame hit the nursery door so hard, it rebounded on its hinges, slamming into the wall with a thunderous crack. Hannah spun, eyes wide, mouth open, in a silent scream. Cooper filled the doorway, fur bristling in a golden halo around his shoulders. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent snarl, ears pinned flat, eyes burning with a feral primal rage. "Imngedo cha toi," she shrieked, her voice breaking into a ragged screech as she backed away, clutching Oliver tighter against her chest. The baby whimpered softly, his head lolling, eyes rolling back under heavy lids. Cooper growled, a sound so deep it rattled the picture frames on the nursery walls. He stepped forward, muscles bunched tail high and rigid. Hannah reached for the rocking chair with one shaking hand, grabbing the metal cash box and raising it like a weapon. "Stay back," she screamed. "I swear to God I'll kill you." Cooper lunged, his massive jaws clamped down on her forearm with bone-crushing force, the thick fur of his ruff brushing Oliver's dangling feet. Hannah howled a scream so raw it scraped the walls, echoing down the darkened hallway like the wail of a dying animal. Blood spattered across the crib sheets, blooming in dark red drops against the pale cotton. She dropped the cash box with a loud metallic crash. Her knees buckled as she staggered backward, her grip on Oliver slipping. Cooper released her arm and snapped at her wrist, forcing her to let go. The baby slid from her grasp into Cooper's waiting jaws. But he did not bite down. Instead, he wrapped his teeth gently around the back of Oliver's onesie, lifting him as he would a puppy, and turned to place him safely into his crib. Hannah clutched her bleeding arms, sobbing in ragged gasps. "You ruined everything," she choked out. "Everything was perfect until you." Cooper turned back to her lips, curling in a silent, rumbling snarl. Hannah stumbled to her feet, blood dripping from her arm onto the nursery rug. She grabbed the tote bag from the floor and spun toward the door, but Cooper blocked her path, his massive frame filling the doorway. He growled again, louder this time, ears flat, teeth bared and gleaming wetly in the moonlight. "Move!" she screamed, swinging the tote bag at his head. The heavy leather connected with his skull with a dull thud, but Cooper didn't flinch. He lunged forward, slamming his chest against hers and driving her back into the wall. Her head cracked against the drywall with a hollow thump, and she sagged to the floor, gasping for breath. Lauren's voice tore through the silence like a gunshot. "Hannah." The nanny's eyes snapped open. She looked up to see Lauren standing in the doorway, face pale, eyes wide with horror. Behind her, the hallway light flickered, illuminating Cooper's bristling silhouette, where he stood protectively over Oliver's crib. "Hannah, what did you do?" Lauren whispered, her voice breaking. Hannah sobbed once, a ragged animal sound. "He wouldn't stop crying," she gasped, clutching her bleeding arm against her chest. "He wouldn't sleep. I just wanted him to sleep." Lauren's gaze shifted to Cooper, who stood with his muzzle pressed against Oliver's cheek, sniffing him gently, whimpering softly. The baby stirred and let out a soft sigh, eyelids fluttering. "Good boy," Lauren whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Good boy." Hannah's expression twisted into a snarl. "He ruined everything," she spat, glaring at Cooper with hate-filled eyes. "You think he's loyal? He's just a filthy animal. He'd tear your throat out if you let him." "No," Lauren said quietly, stepping forward. "He's protecting his family. From people like you." She reached down and pulled the baby monitor camera from the crib rail, turning it to show Hannah its glowing red recording light. The nanny's face drained of color, her mouth opening in a silent scream. "I saw everything," Lauren said, her voice trembling with cold fury. "The drugs, the money, all of it." Hannah lunged forward with a shriek, hands clawing for the camera. Cooper snarled and leapt between them, his massive jaws clamping down on her shoulder. She screamed again, high and shrill, thrashing against him. The room filled with the sound of ripping fabric and ragged gasps. Downstairs, the front door burst open. David's voice boomed through the house. "Lauren, what's happening?" Up here, she screamed back, tears streaming down her cheeks. "David, hurry." Footsteps thundered up the stairs. David appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of Cooper pinning Hannah to the floor, her sweater soaked with blood, Oliver wailing in his crib. "Oh my God," he whispered, stumbling forward. "Lauren, what?" "Call the police," Lauren choked out, clutching the baby monitor against her chest. "Call them now." David pulled out his phone with shaking hands, his fingers fumbling on the screen. Hannah let out a low, broken sob, her body going limp beneath Cooper's massive paws. Outside, the distant wail of approaching sirens rose through the quiet night, echoing through the darkened trees like the call of hunting wolves. Lauren sank to her knees beside Oliver's crib, reaching in to scoop him into her arms. His tiny body curled against her chest, warm and limp, breathing shallow, but steady. Cooper stepped back, panting heavily. Blood smeared across his muzzle and chest. Lauren reached out and buried her fingers in his thick ruff, pulling him close. "Good boy," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "You saved him. You saved us." The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue through the nursery windows. Hannah lay sobbing on the floor, clutching her torn shoulder. Her eyes glazed and empty as her blood pooled across the pale rug. Cooper pressed closer to Lauren, his body trembling with adrenaline, eyes locked on Oliver's face. Outside, the night wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and blood and cold moonlight. And in that quiet, broken moment, with her baby breathing softly against her chest and her loyal guardian standing watch beside her, Lauren knew the nightmare was not over, but they had survived this night. Together, the night air inside the nursery seemed to thrum with electricity, vibrating against the walls with each ragged breath Hannah drew. Her pale pink cardigan hung askew, soaked with dark smears of blood from Cooper's bite. Her hair fell in tangled ropes across her face, eyes wide and rolling with feral panic. She pressed herself back against the wall, clutching the small leather pouch of Lauren's jewelry to her chest. Diamonds and pearls glittered faintly in the moonlight, streaming through the nursery window, flickering like a predator's eyes in the dark. Oliver whimpered in his crib, the thin, reedy sound slicing through the suffocating silence like a blade. His tiny arms twitched feebly, lips parted in a silent cry, his face mottled blue beneath the gauzy glow of the nightlight. "Shut up," Hannah hissed, her voice cracking as she lurched toward him. "Just shut up already." Cooper growled low and deep in his chest, hackles bristling in a golden ruff along his spine. His paws shifted across the rug with restless precision as he stepped between Hannah and the crib, his massive frame filling the narrow space. "Move, you filthy mutt!" Hannah shrieked, swinging the jewelry pouch like a weapon. Diamonds clattered together with sharp metallic chimes. She kicked out viciously, her ballet flat connecting with Cooper's ribs with a dull, fleshy thud. He didn't flinch. His lips peeled back from his teeth, ears flattened tight against his skull. A deep, guttural snarl rumbled from his chest, vibrating the wooden crib slats behind him. "Get out of my way!" Hannah screamed, lashing out again. This time her foot struck his muzzle, jerking his head sideways. He stumbled, blinking hard saliva and blood spraying across the white nursery rug. Oliver let out a thin, gurgling cry. His chest fluttered with each ragged breath, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching weakly at his sides. Hannah lunged forward, reaching into the crib with trembling hands. "Come here," she gasped, snatching him up by the armpits. His head lolled back, eyelids flickering, as his body sagged limply against her chest. Cooper roared. The sound was so deep, it rattled the nursery window panes. He surged forward, jaws snapping shut around Hannah's ankle, with bone-crushing force. She screamed a high, thin animal sound, stumbling backward as she lost her grip on Oliver. For a heart-stopping instant, he dangled in the air between them, his onesie stretching taut around his shoulders as he fell. Then a pair of shaking hands caught him from below, gathering him against a trembling chest. Lauren, her eyes were wild hair tangled around her sweat-slicked face, pajamas twisted from sleep. She clutched Oliver against her chest, tears streaking down her cheeks as she pressed trembling lips to his forehead. "Oh, God," she sobbed, rocking him as his limbs twitched feebly. "Oh, God, baby, please. Please!" Hannah let out a ragged shriek and swung her fist down onto Cooper's head again and again, her nails raking across his muzzle as she tried to force him to release her ankle. Blood splattered across the nursery walls in dark crimson arcs with each savage strike. "Let go," she screamed. "Let go, you worthless animal." Cooper snarled and bit down harder, his teeth grinding against bone. Hannah collapsed to the floor with a strangled cry, clawing at his face in blind panic. The jewelry pouch slipped from her fingers, scattering diamonds across the rug like fallen stars. Lauren stumbled backward, clutching Oliver against her chest, her eyes wide and unblinking as she watched the scene unfold in frozen horror. Oliver's head lolled against her shoulder, his lips parted, skin pale and waxy in the dim light. "Hannah, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Hannah's eyes snapped up to hers, widow and fever bright. Her lips twisted into a snarl, flecks of spittle glinting in the moonlight. He wouldn't stop crying, she spat, tears streaking down her blood-smeared face. He wouldn't sleep. "I just wanted him to sleep," Lauren sobbed, shaking her head as she pressed Oliver closer. His chest fluttered beneath her fingers, each breath shallow and ragged. "Hannah, please," she begged, voice cracking. "Please, he needs help. He's not breathing right. Let me call 911. But Hannah wasn't listening. She scrambled to her knees, dragging her bleeding leg out of Cooper's jaws with a wet, tearing sound. She lurched to her feet, swaying unsteadily as blood pooled around her ballet flats. "Give him to me," she gasped, lunging forward with shaking hands outstretched. "Give him back." Cooper roared again and launched himself at her chest, slamming her backward into the wall with a deafening crash. Picture frames shattered around them, glass raining down onto the rug like falling ice. Hannah screamed as Cooper's jaws closed around her forearm, his teeth slicing through flesh and tendon with horrifying ease. She swung her fist down onto his head again and again, her screams rising to a high, ragged wail. Blood sprayed across his golden fur in dark, glistening streaks, but he didn't release her. His eyes burned with feral, primal rage as he drove her back against the wall, snarling deep and low, with each savage shake of his massive head. "Stop!" Lauren screamed, clutching Oliver tighter as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Please, Cooper, stop. You'll kill her." But Cooper didn't stop. He snarled and shook his head again, tearing another ragged scream from Hannah's throat. Her knees buckled as she slid down the wall, sobbing and gasping, her blood pooling across the rug in a widening stain. Suddenly, with a final desperate shriek, she shoved Cooper's snout away and staggered to her feet. Her face was pale and waxy, streaked with tears and blood, her hair plastered to her sweaty cheeks. She grabbed the fallen jewelry pouch from the floor and turned to flee, limping heavily on her torn leg. Lauren stumbled backward, clutching Oliver against her chest as she pressed herself into the corner of the nursery. Cooper let out a deep, rattling growl and lunged forward, his paws thudding across the rug with thunderous force. He slammed into Hannah's side, knocking her off balance with a hoarse, ragged scream. She crashed to the floor, the jewelry pouch skittering out of her grasp. Diamonds rolled across the room, bouncing under the crib and dresser, flashing like tiny lightning bolts in the moonlight. "Move!" she shrieked, scrambling to her knees. "Get away from me, you filthy animal." Cooper stepped forward, his massive frame looming over her as he lowered his head, lips curling back from his teeth. His growl rumbled deep and low, vibrating the floor beneath them. Saliva and blood dripped from his jaws, pooling on the rug beside Hannah's trembling hands. She froze, eyes vista-wide and glassy with terror. Her chest heaved in ragged gasps as she stared up at him, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The nursery fell silent, except for Oliver's shallow fluttering breaths and the steady rumbling snarl that rattled in Cooper's chest. Lauren sobbed softly, clutching Oliver tighter against her chest. She pressed her cheek to his damp, fevered skin, rocking him as tears spilled down her face. "Good boy," she whispered, voice breaking. "Good boy." Outside, the distant wail of approaching sirens rose through the darkness, echoing through the pine forest like a hunting wolf's cry. Cooper didn't move. His massive body blocked the nursery door completely. Hackle's bristling eyes locked on Hannah with cold, unwavering fury. And in that silent, trembling moment, with her baby breathing raggedly against her chest and her loyal guardian standing sentinel before her, Lauren knew this was far from over. But tonight they would survive. Together, the sirens screamed through the silent forest like wolves, hunting under a blood moon, flashing blue and red across the tall pine trunks lining the driveway. Gravel crunched under the weight of speeding cruisers as the sheriff's deputies barreled up to the Miller House radios, crackling with urgent dispatch chatter. Lauren crouched on the nursery floor, cradling Oliver's limp, fever-warm body against her chest. His breath came in thin, ragged gasps that rattled in his throat like a dying bird. Tears streamed down her face unchecked as she rocked him, her hair falling in tangled curtains to shield him from the chaos swirling around them. Cooper stood at her side, his massive golden frame blocking the shattered nursery doorway. His muzzle dripped blood onto the carpet, eyes locked with unblinking intensity on Hannah, who crouched, trembling against the far wall. Her cardigan hung in torn ribbons around her shoulders, blood seeping dark and wet through the fabric. Her breath came in shallow, wheezing gasps, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. The pounding of boots on the stairs reverberated through the house, shaking the picture frames against the walls. Shouts cut through the silence. Deep male voices barking orders, sharp feminine tones crackling with urgency. The hallway light flickered as deputies swarmed the landing, guns drawn, vests bulked tight over their chests. "Sheriff's Department," a deputy shouted, his flashlight sweeping the nursery in a harsh arc of white light. "Hands in the air now," Hannah whimpered, raising trembling, blood-smeared hands above her head. Her fingers shook violently, flecks of blood spattering across the pale nursery wallpaper. "Step away from the woman and the child." Another deputy barked at Cooper, his voice quavering with unease as he leveled his service pistol at the massive golden dog. Lauren's scream tore through the room. "Don't shoot him," she sobbed, clutching Oliver tighter. "He saved us. Please, don't shoot." Cooper lowered his head, ears pinned flat against his skull. A low, rumbling growl vibrated deep in his chest as he pressed himself protectively against Lauren's side. "Easy," one of the deputies murmured, his voice softening as he lowered his weapon. "Easy, boy. We're here to help." Two officers moved forward, cuffing Hannah's wrists behind her back with sharp metallic clicks. She screamed when they hauled her upright, her knees buckling as her torn ankle gave way beneath her. Blood streamed down her leg to pool on the pale nursery rug, mingling with the scattered diamonds and pearls glittering coldly in the flashlight beams. "Get EMS up here," a deputy barked into his radio, nodding toward Oliver. "Infant in respiratory distress. We need medics now." Lauren pressed her face against Oliver's damp hair, sobbing silently as paramedics pushed into the room, their red trauma bags thumping against their thighs. Cooper pressed his massive head into her side, his nose cold and wet against her ribs. She buried her fingers in his blood-matted ruff, clinging to him, as the medics worked around her, placing an oxygen mask over Oliver's tiny face and hooking sensors to his chest with quick, efficient movements. Hannah let out a broken, breathless laugh as the deputies dragged her toward the door. Her hair fell in tangled ropes across her face, eyes glittering with a feral, feverish light. She stumbled, crying out as her torn ankle buckled beneath her weight. Lauren raised her head, eyes burning with silent rage as she watched them pull Hannah away. Their gazes locked across the wreckage of the nursery. Shattered picture frames, blood-stained carpet, scattered jewels sparkling like broken stars. A smile flickered across Hannah's lips. Her voice was hoarse, ragged, dripping with venom. Maikomsung katatka. She hissed her words, curling through the air like poison. You think he saved you? That filthy dog, he can't protect you forever. Lauren's breath caught in her chest. Hannah's words twisted like barbed wire around her ribcage, sharp and cold. She pressed Oliver tighter against her chest, her tears falling silently onto his pale, clammy skin. Get her out of here, the deputy growled, shoving Hannah forward. She stumbled, her laughter echoing down the hallway like the shriek of a dying bird. They dragged her down the stairs, her blood leaving smeared handprints along the white banister. Cooper growled deep in his chest, the sound vibrating through the soles of Lauren's feet as she sat trembling on the nursery floor. Outside, the night pulsed with flashing lights. Deputies moved in purposeful lines across the yard, radios crackling with clipped commands. The paramedics lifted Oliver into a small portable cot, oxygen tubes taped beneath his tiny nose. His eyelids fluttered weakly as they wheeled him down the hallway toward the waiting ambulance. Lauren followed in a daze, her hand buried in Cooper's thick fur. The golden retriever moved beside her with silent, watchful steps, his tail held high and rigid ears pinned tight against his skull. Blood smeared across his muzzle and chest, soaking into his thick ruff in dark rust-colored clumps. The deputies loaded Hannah into the back of a cruiser, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. Her face was pale and waxy in the flashing blue lights, eyes glassy with shock and pain. As they buckled her into the rear seat, she lifted her head and locked eyes with Lauren across the driveway. Maikomsunkatatka, she whispered again, her voice muffled by the closed windows. Her lips twisted into a crooked, blood-smeared smile. You'll never be enough. Lauren felt her knees buckle. She clutched Cooper's ruff with trembling fingers, fighting the hot rush of nausea that surged up her throat. Hannah's gaze burned into hers like acid, eating away at the thin veneer of her composure. The cruiser door slammed shut, cutting off Hannah's voice mid-word. The deputies moved quickly, pulling away down the driveway with tires crunching over gravel. The red taillights vanished into the dark pine forest, leaving only the wail of distant sirens echoing between the trees. Lauren sank to her knees on the cold concrete porch, sobbing into Cooper's blood-matted fur. The golden retriever pressed closer, his massive body warm and solid against hers. He whined softly, licking tears from her cheeks with slow, deliberate strokes of his rough tongue. The paramedics wheeled Oliver toward the waiting ambulance. His small body was swaddled in a fleece blanket, an oxygen mask taped gently to his face. Lauren staggered to her feet, reaching out with trembling hands to touch his tiny fingers where they curled limply against his chest. Please, she whispered to the paramedic, please save him. We're doing everything we can, ma'am, the medic said, gently squeezing her shoulder before climbing into the back of the ambulance. The rear doors slammed shut with a hollow metallic clang, and the sirens screamed to life, wailing into the night as the ambulance tore down the long, winding driveway toward the hospital. Lauren watched the red and blue lights flicker through the pine trees until they vanished into the darkness. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, each inhalation scraping her throat raw. Cooper pressed his massive head against her hip, his ears' pinned-back tail curled tight against his hind legs. She sank to her knees again, burying her face in his thick, blood-matted ruff. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks, soaking into his golden fur. His body trembled against hers, the adrenaline still coursing through his muscles in violent, uncontrollable shivers. You saved him, she whispered into his fur, her voice cracking with grief and relief and bottomless gratitude. You saved him, Cooper. Good boy. Good boy. The deputies moved quietly around them, their radios crackling softly as they documented the scene. The shattered nursery window, the blood pooling on the pale carpet, the scattered jewelry glittering coldly in the moonlight. One deputy knelt beside Lauren, his voice low and gentle. Ma'am, we'll need to take your statement as soon as you're ready. Lauren nodded numbly, her fingers tightening in Cooper's ruff. Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she stared down the driveway, the flashing lights fading into the darkness. I'll do whatever you need, she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. Just, please, make sure she never comes back. The deputy nodded, his gaze somber. We'll make sure of it, ma'am. She won't hurt anyone else ever again. Lauren closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to Cooper's broad skull. His body shuddered with each ragged breath, but he didn't move away. His warmth seeped into her bones, grounding her in that moment of trembling silence. And as the dawn crept across the horizon, bleeding pale gold through the dark pine trees, Lauren knew with bone-deep certainty, no matter how dark the night, no matter how monstrous the threat, they would survive. Because Cooper would never stop fighting for them. Not tonight, not ever. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric intensive care unit buzzed softly overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow across the small hospital room. The walls were painted a cheerful mint green decals of giraffes and teddy bears dancing along the edges, but the color felt thin and meaningless under the crushing weight of what had happened. Oliver lay curled in his crib, swaddled tightly in a pale yellow blanket. His skin, once plump with baby warmth, looked waxy and pale under the glow of the cardiac monitor taped to his chest. Thin wires trailed from his tiny body to the machines beeping steadily beside the crib, each electronic pulse measuring his fragile grip on life. Lauren sat hunched in the hard plastic chair beside him, elbows on her knees, face buried in trembling hands. Her dark hair fell forward to shield her eyes, damp strands clinging to her flushed cheeks. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, each breath ragged and uneven, scraping against her throat like shards of glass. David stood at the foot of the crib, arms folded tightly across his chest. His knuckles gleamed white under the taut pull of his skin, his eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of Oliver's chest. Each mechanical beep from the heart monitor stabbed into his skull like an electric current, and with every breath his son took, he felt his lungs finally unclench just for a moment. But when the pause between Oliver's breaths stretched too long, his chest would seize again with blind, suffocating fear. In the far corner of the room, Cooper lay curled into a tight golden ball. His massive head rested between his front paws, eyes open and unblinking, as they tracked every movement, every breath, every flicker of the IV machine's green digital readout. His tail lay limp against the linoleum floor, unmoving, even when nurses bustled in and out to adjust Oliver's medications. His fur looked dull under the harsh hospital lights, matted with dried blood around his muzzle and chest. His ears hung low against his skull eyes, heavy with exhaustion. Overnight, it seemed as though years had carved themselves into his face, etching deep lines of worry through the golden fur around his eyes and across his broad forehead. A nurse entered quietly, checking the monitors with quick, efficient motions. She glanced down at Cooper, pausing for a moment, as her eyes softened with silent understanding. "He hasn't left his side since we admitted him," she said softly to Lauren. "Most therapy dogs don't last longer than a few hours in here before they need a break. But him? He hasn't even moved." Lauren lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen with tears. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. She reached out with trembling fingers, curling them into Cooper's thick ruff. His ears flicked once at her touch, and he leaned his massive head into her palm with a low, aching whine. "He won't leave him," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of grief and gratitude. "Not until he knows Oliver is safe." The nurse nodded silently, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. She finished her checks quickly and slipped from the room, pulling the door shut with a soft click behind her. For a long, heavy moment, silence filled the room. The only sounds were the quiet beeping of monitors, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine, and the ragged, uneven breaths of two parents watching their entire world flicker in and out of the shadows of death. David turned and sank into the chair beside Lauren, reaching out to grip her cold, trembling hand. Their fingers interlaced automatically, seeking an anchor in the other's grasp. "He's going to come back to us," David whispered, his voice cracking despite the steel he forced into it. "He's strong, Lauren. Just like you." She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks in silent streams. "No baby should have to be strong," she whispered. "He's just a baby, David. Just a baby." Cooper let out a low, rumbling whine from the corner, his tail thumping weakly once against the floor. He dragged himself to his feet with slow, trembling movements, his joints cracking with each stiff step. The golden retriever limped forward until his massive head rested against the edge of Oliver's crib. He pressed his cold, wet nose against Oliver's tiny hand, where it curled limply atop the blanket. His eyes closed for a moment, his chest rising and falling in deep, trembling breaths. When he opened his eyes again, they were damp and glassy, reflecting the monitor lights like twin shards of amber glass. Lauren reached out and buried her fingers in his fur, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, her voice breaking with grief and love. "Such a good boy. Don't you dare leave him now." Cooper leaned into her touch, letting out another soft whine as his tail gave a tired thump against the floor. His golden coat shimmered dully under the fluorescent lights, each strand etched with the pale silver of age and exhaustion. The door opened again, and Dr. Patel entered, clipboard in hand, eyes tired but kind behind his glasses. He glanced down at Cooper for a long moment, then back up to Lauren and David. "His blood levels are stabilizing," he said softly. Flipping through the papers on his clipboard, we're flushing the sedative out of his system, and he's responding to the IV fluids. It'll take time for him to fully wake up, but the worst is over. Lauren let out a choked sob, pressing her forehead to Cooper's neck as her body trembled with silent relief. David sagged back in his chair, his eyes closing as a single tear slipped down his cheek. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Thank you so much." Dr. Patel nodded, his gaze flicking back to Cooper. "You should thank him," he said softly. "If not for your dog's intervention, we would be having a very different conversation right now." Cooper let out a quiet sigh, his tail curling tighter around his hind legs. His eyelids drooped heavily as he pressed his nose against Oliver's small, trembling hand. "He hasn't slept in days," Lauren whispered, her fingers carding through the blood-matted fur behind his ears. "He just sits here, watching him, protecting him, even now." Dr. Patel nodded again, his gaze solemn. "He knows his job isn't done yet." For hours they sat like that, in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their cold glow across the small room as dawn began to creep pale and pink across the hospital windows. Nurses came and went in quiet waves, adjusting IV lines, checking monitors, scribbling silent notes on their clipboards. And through it all, Cooper never moved. When Oliver whimpered in his sleep, his tiny fists curling against his chest, Cooper's ears twitched forward, his eyes locked on the baby's face with unwavering intensity. When the monitors beeped an alarm, he stood with a groan of stiff joints, pressing his massive head against the rails of the crib until the nurses reassured him with quiet, soothing words. At dusk, Lauren drifted into a restless sleep, her head resting against David's shoulder. Her breaths came in shallow, trembling gasps, eyelids twitching with nightmares too heavy to name. David sat rigid and unmoving, his gaze locked on his son's chest, rising and falling beneath the oxygen tubes. His free hand rested on Cooper's head, fingers curling into the thick golden fur in silent gratitude. The overhead lights dimmed with the setting sun, leaving the room awash in soft shadows. The beeping of the monitors slowed, settling into a steady rhythmic pulse that filled the silence with its quiet reassurance. And still Cooper did not move. He stood sentinel through the long, quiet hours of night, his massive body trembling with exhaustion, eyes red-rimmed and heavy with sleeplessness. His breaths came in soft, ragged pants, each inhalation scraping painfully against his ribs. But he never looked away. Not for a moment, because he knew, in the silent, instinctual way only dogs understand, that his job was not yet done, that this small, fragile human needed him, that his family needed him. And so, he stood vigil beneath the flickering hospital lights, blood drying in clumps along his muzzle. Golden fur dulled with exhaustion, amber eyes locked on the tiny rise and fall of Oliver's chest, watching, guarding, loving. Until his final breath, he would not leave his side, because that was what it meant to protect. That was what it meant to love. That was what it meant to be Cooper. The morning sun filtered softly through the gauzy hospital curtains, washing the room in pale gold light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, swirling in quiet eddies above the crib where Oliver lay sleeping. His tiny chest rose and fell in fragile, uneven rhythm beneath the edge of the fleece blanket tucked under his chin. Lauren sat curled in the recliner beside him, her knees drawn tight to her chest, arms wrapped protectively around her legs. Dark half-moons shadowed her eyes, her skin pale and drawn from sleepless nights and silent tears. She watched her son's eyelids twitch, with each dream her heart clenching, with a silent ache she couldn't name. Beside the crib, Cooper lay curled in his familiar guardian's pose, his massive golden body pressed up against the rails. His head rested on his front paws, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, but never fully closed. Each time Oliver whimpered or shifted in his sleep, Cooper's ears twitched forward, his eyes opening wide, amber gaze scanning the room for threats invisible to human eyes. He hadn't left Oliver's side in days. Not when nurses wheeled in their rattling carts to check vitals. Not when the doctors spoke in low, worried voices about sedation levels and neurological monitoring. Not when Lauren wept into her folded arms in the dim hush of pre-dawn quiet. He simply stayed, watching, guarding, loving. By the end of the week, the sedatives had flushed from Oliver's system, but something in him remained bruised and raw. He slept often, his small body curling tightly around itself, fists clenching and unclenching against his chest. But when darkness fell, a deep primal fear seemed to rise within him, sending him into high, keening cries that shattered the silence of their home. Lauren would rock him for hours, in the deep shadows of his nursery, humming broken lullabies against his sweat-damp hair. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, pooling at the corner of her mouth, salty and warm. David would stand in the doorway, his silhouette long and dark against the dim hallway light, helpless in the face of his son's terror. But it was Cooper who became Oliver's tether to calm. One night, as Lauren rocked Oliver through another round of trembling sobs, Cooper rose from his place beside the crib. His joints cracked with age and exhaustion, but he moved with silent purpose to stand beside her chair. He pressed his massive head against Oliver's tiny feet, where they kicked beneath the blanket, his cold nose bumping against the edge of the baby's footed pajamas. His ears flicked forward as Oliver let out a startled hiccup, his sobs catching in his throat. Slowly, tentatively, Oliver's cries quieted. His breath evened into slow, trembling sighs. His tiny fingers unclenched from Lauren's hair to grasp at the soft golden fur brushing his toes. Lauren froze, her tears falling faster as she stared down at the dog, who had once again done what no doctor, no sedative, no parent could do. She pressed her cheek to Oliver's warm forehead, her sobs silent but shaking her entire body. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking in the dark. "Thank you, Cooper. I don't know what we'd do without you." From that night on, Cooper slept pressed up against Oliver's crib, his massive golden body curled around the wooden rails like a living rampart. Each time Oliver whimpered in his sleep, Cooper's tail thumped softly against the rug. Each time he cried out, Cooper would press his cold nose through the bars until the baby's tiny fingers wrapped tight around the thick fur. Within a week, Oliver's night terrors quieted into restless dreams. Within 2, he slept deeply, his small face finally smoothing into the soft peace of dreamless slumber. It was a pediatric trauma therapist who first suggested it. Lauren sat hunched in the beige armchair in Dr. Wilson's office, her fingers twisting in her lap as she stared down at the worn carpet. Cooper sat at her feet pressed so close, his warmth seeped through her jeans and into her bones. "You said Cooper sleeps beside Oliver's crib every night?" Dr. Wilson said, tapping her pen thoughtfully against the edge of her desk. "Has he ever been formally trained for therapy work?" Lauren shook her head, brushing a strand of dark hair back behind her ear. "No, he's just Cooper. He's always protected Oliver, even before Hannah." Dr. Wilson nodded, her eyes warm behind her tortoiseshell glasses. "I think he would excel at it." Therapy dogs are trained to recognize anxiety triggers to provide silent emotional grounding. Oliver clearly finds security in his presence. Formal training could deepen that connection and give you both the confidence to rely on him in the long term. Lauren looked down at Cooper, at the deep, silvering fur around his muzzle, the dark, tired hollows beneath his amber eyes. She reached out and curled her fingers into his ruff, feeling the slow, steady thump of his tail against the carpet. "Would you like that, old boy?" she whispered, her voice breaking into a smile for the first time in weeks. "Would you like to help other little ones, like you've helped him?" Cooper raised his massive head, his tongue lolling out in a silent, panting grin. He leaned into her touch with a deep, contented sigh, his entire body trembling with quiet relief. They enrolled him in therapy dog training the next week. Lauren watched from the sidelines as Cooper moved through the agility course with slow, deliberate steps. His joints stiff with age, but his eyes bright with purpose. He sat patiently as toddlers toddled up to bury their faces in his golden fur, his tail thumping slow and steady against the grass. He learned to sit beside children's wheelchairs, to place his massive head gently in their trembling laps. He learned to sense night terrors before they erupted into screams, to wake sleeping children with gentle nuzzles before fear could take root. He learned to stand sentinel beside hospital beds, his slow, steady breaths syncing with the beep of heart monitors until restless limbs quieted into calm. At the end of each session, Lauren would crouch beside him, pressing her forehead against his massive golden skull. Tears would fill her eyes as she whispered soft words into his warm fur. "You're saving them," she'd whisper, her voice trembling with love and awe. "Just like you saved him. Just like you saved me." It was during one of these training sessions that Lauren felt it. A quiet certainty rising deep in her chest, coiling around her ribs like ivy in bloom. When Cooper's certification was complete, she handed in her resignation at the law firm. Her colleagues were stunned. Offers of extended leave poured and promises of partnership put on the table. But Lauren simply shook her head, her dark eyes calm and steady. "I need to do something that matters," she said softly, gathering her personal files into a cardboard box. "Something that saves lives, not just arguments." She sold their downtown condo, liquidated her retirement investments, and purchased a stretch of land on the outskirts of town. 20 acres of rolling fields and dense pine forest, bisected by a silver creek that babbled through the undergrowth like quiet laughter. She built a barn there, small at first with room for a dozen dogs. She painted it warm terracotta with white trim, hanging a carved wooden sign above the entrance. Cooper's Haven, therapy dog rescue and training. At dawn, each morning, she would stand on the wide porch with a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, watching the mist drift low across the fields. Behind her, dogs barked and whined and yipped with excitement, tails thumping against kennel doors, their eyes bright with hope. Cooper sat beside her, his fur gleaming gold in the rising sun, his nose twitching as he scented the cool morning air. His body was slower now, his steps stiff with age, but his eyes burned with purpose each time Lauren clipped on his therapy vest. They spent their days together training rescues, Battered shepherds with broken spirits, anxious retrievers, trembling in corners, scarred pit bulls with hearts desperate for forgiveness. Cooper moved among them with silent authority, his gentle nudges and deep rumbling growls shaping their fears into quiet confidence. At night, when the work was done and the sun had sunk beyond the pines, Lauren would carry a sleeping Oliver out onto the porch. She'd sit on the top step with her son curled against her chest, his breath warm against her neck. Cooper would lie at her feet, his massive golden head resting on her thigh, his tail sweeping slowly against the porch boards. Together, they would watch the stars bloom bright across the indigo sky. The scent of pine sap and clean hay drifted through the night air, wrapping around them like a prayer. Sometimes when the world fell quiet and Oliver slept dreamless against her shoulder, Lauren would look down at Cooper at the silver that frosted his muzzle and the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his fur. "Thank you," she'd whisper, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "For everything." And in those quiet moonlit moments, with the breeze lifting her hair and the night pulsing with cricket song, she felt a peace she had never known in any courtroom victory. Here in this sanctuary built from grief and love and unwavering loyalty, she had found the truest meaning of justice: to save what was broken, to protect what was helpless, to heal what the world had cast aside. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that this life, this work, this family, was where she was always meant to be. The morning sun rose slowly over Cooper's haven, spilling pale gold light across the dew-damp grass. Birds sang from the branches of the towering pines that encircled the clearing, their songs clear and bright in the crisp dawn air. The wooden fence that bordered the therapy field glowed amber in the rising light, its fresh cedar planks still fragrant with the memory of the forest they came from. David stood in the middle of the field, hammer in hand, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool breeze. His t-shirt clung to his back as he measured the final plank of the new playground ramp, the tape measure trembling slightly in his grip. He paused, wiping his brow with the inside of his wrist, and looked up across the field. Lauren sat under the old oak tree with Oliver in her lap. The little boy squirmed his small legs, kicking excitedly as he pointed toward the wooden fort David was finishing. His hair glowed like burnished copper in the morning sun, his cheeks flushed with delight. Beside them, Cooper sat tall and watchful, his golden fur rippling in the breeze. He watched David work with calm, unwavering eyes, his ears flicking forward each time Oliver giggled. His massive tail lay curled across his paws, thumping softly against the grass each time Oliver reached out to touch him. It had been 3 months since they opened the therapy playground. 3 months of long, back-breaking days for David as he transformed the weedy backfield into a haven of swings, climbing frames, wooden bridges, and slides. He built it not only for Oliver, but for the therapy dogs who came to train at Cooper's Haven, for the foster children who visited with social workers, for the veterans in trauma recovery who volunteered at the rescue. He built it to heal what could not be healed by words alone. On the final day of construction, as he sank the last post into the rich, dark soil, Lauren brought him lemonade in a chipped mason jar. She pressed the cold glass into his shaking hand and kissed the line of sweat along his temple. "He's going to love it," she whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "You're giving him a childhood he'll never forget." David's voice cracked as he answered, "I'm building what I never had." Now, weeks later, he watched as Oliver toddled unsteadily toward the playground ramp. His son's legs wobbled with each step, the weight of his tiny body almost too much for his thin, unsteady limbs. He stumbled once, his knees buckling, but before he could fall, Cooper moved. The golden retriever rose from where he lay, his joints cracking softly with age. In 3 silent steps, he was beside Oliver, pressing his massive body against the child's side. Oliver reached out instinctively, his tiny fingers curling into the thick golden fur. Cooper shifted his weight, bracing himself with careful precision, his paws planted wide and strong against the earth. Together they took another step. Oliver giggled with delight, his voice carrying across the field like birdsong. He clung to Cooper's fur as the dog moved slowly forward, matching the child's hesitant pace with infinite patience. His tail swept the grass behind them in slow, steady arcs, his ears flicking back to listen for each breathless giggle. Lauren pressed her hands to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes as she watched her son's first true steps. David set down his hammer, his heart twisting with a quiet, aching joy that stole the air from his lungs. Step by step, Oliver crossed the field. Step by step, Cooper guided him. When they reached the ramp of the playground, Fort Oliver squealed with triumph. He patted Cooper's side with chubby hands, his fingers sinking deep into the golden fur. Cooper stood perfectly still, His massive body braced like a living pillar as Oliver pressed his forehead against his ribs. Lauren rose and ran across the grass, scooping Oliver into her arms. She kissed his flushed cheeks, his damp curls the soft, downy place at the nape of his neck. Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm and silent, as she whispered, "You did it, baby. You did it." Oliver twisted in her arms, reaching out for Cooper. The dog pressed forward, nuzzling his nose into Oliver's tiny chest. His tail wagged once, twice, before curling still again at his paws. "He wouldn't have done it without you," Lauren whispered, her voice breaking with gratitude. "You're his hero, Cooper. You always will be." The golden retriever lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers. In their depths was something ancient and silent, a wisdom beyond human comprehension. The quiet knowledge of a creature who had devoted every breath, every heartbeat, to protecting what mattered most. Behind them, David hammered the last nail into place on the climbing frame and set down his tools. He watched his wife and son with quiet pride, his chest aching with a fierce, tender love that brought tears to his eyes. He walked across the grass and knelt beside Cooper, wrapping his arms around the dog's broad shoulders. "Thank you, old man," he whispered into the thick golden fur. "You're the best damn thing that's ever happened to us." Cooper let out a low, rumbling sigh and pressed his head against David's chest. His tail thumped softly against the grass, a sound that spoke of love, deeper than words. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the other therapy dogs were released into the playground. Golden retrievers with scars across their muzzles, shepherds missing and ear pit bulls with clouded eyes. Each one trained by Cooper, each one carrying within them the memory of his silent, patient guidance. They ran across the grass with unbridled joy, their tails high, their ears pinned back in the pure, wild ecstasy of freedom. Oliver squealed with laughter as they bounded past him, their tongues lolling in wide, happy grins. Lauren set him down on the grass, and he toddled forward his unsteady steps, carrying him straight into the swirling pack. They circled him, licking his face and hands with gentle, curious nudges. In the middle of it all, Cooper stood tall and proud, his tail wagging slowly as he watched his protégés play. David wrapped his arms around Lauren from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Together they watched their son disappear into the warm chaos of fur and wagging tails. "He's going to grow up strong," David whispered against her hair. "Because of him." Lauren nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "He's his guardian angel." David pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck. "No," he said softly. "He's our guardian angel." As the morning drifted into afternoon, the playground rang with laughter and barking. Volunteers arrived to help with therapy sessions. Children in wheelchairs rolled across the ramp David had built, leaning down to bury their fingers in golden fur. Veterans in loose hospital scrubs walked slowly beside the rescue dogs, their haunted eyes brightening with each silent, steadfast step. Cooper moved among them all with quiet grace. His head held high, despite the tremor in his limbs, his tail sweeping in slow, steady arcs. Where he walked, fear lessened. Where he paused, hope bloomed. At sunset, as golden light bled into pink and lavender across the sky, Lauren called Oliver back to her side. He toddled across the grass, his face flushed with exhaustion and joy. Cooper walked beside him, their shadows stretched long and fused together on the ground. When they reached her, Oliver turned and wrapped his small arms around Cooper's thick neck. He pressed his cheek against the golden fur and whispered something only the dog could hear. Cooper closed his eyes, leaning into the child's touch, his tail curling slowly around his paws. The breeze lifted his fur, revealing patches of pale silver that glowed in the dying light. David crouched beside them, his voice quiet and trembling as he spoke. "He'll never remember these days," he whispered, his eyes on Oliver's small hand buried in Cooper's ruff. "But they'll shape him forever." Lauren nodded, tears thick in her voice. "He'll always know he was loved, that he was protected." As twilight fell and the playground quieted, David scooped Oliver into his arms, cradling the sleeping boy against his chest. Lauren bent down and wrapped her arms around Cooper's massive neck, pressing her forehead to his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with love and gratitude. "For every step, for every breath, for every heartbeat you've given us." Cooper whined softly, licking a single tear from her cheek. His eyes glowed in the dusk, silent and wise, holding within them the echoes of something eternal. They walked back to the house together under the first bloom of stars. David carried Oliver in his arms. Lauren walked beside him, her hand resting on Cooper's broad back. And Cooper, hero of silent strength, walked with slow, proud steps. The guardian who asked for nothing, who saved everything, and who would never, ever leave their side. The late afternoon sun poured across the rolling pastures of Cooper's Haven in liquid gold, brushing the long summer grass with warm light. Dragonflies hovered in slow dancing arcs above the clover patches. The air was rich with the scent of pine sap and sweet hay carried in on the gentle breeze that rustled the cottonwood leaves lining the property's edge. From the porch of the small farmhouse, Lauren watched it all unfold with quiet, aching contentment. She held a mug of chamomile tea between her palms, the steam curling in soft white ribbons beneath her chin. The tea had long since gone cold, forgotten as she drank in the view before her. Underneath the great oak in the center of the yard, Cooper lay sprawled in a wide crescent of golden fur. His massive head rested between his front paws, his ears twitching lazily each time a cicada droned or a distant crow called from the treetops. Sunlight dappled his back, highlighting the deepening silver that frosted his muzzle and the soft hollows beneath his eyes. Beside him, Oliver sat cross-legged in the grass, a battered picture book propped open across his knees. His copper hair glowed like burnished gold in the fading light, tousled and wild, sticking up in cowlicks along the back of his neck. He read aloud in his small piping voice, the words stumbling from his lips with the careful precision of early literacy. And then the little bear said, "I love you, Mama, forever and ever." He paused, glancing sideways at Cooper to make sure his audience was paying attention. The old dog flicked his ear in acknowledgement, letting out a low, rumbling sigh of contentment. Oliver grinned and reached out with one small hand, burying his fingers deep into the thick golden ruff along Cooper's neck. Lauren's chest tightened with a sudden rush of tears. She pressed her fist to her mouth, her eyes blurring with love, so fierce and overwhelming it carved an ache straight through her ribs. She saw them silhouetted in the falling sun, the small boy with his tattered book. His body curled protectively against the massive shape of his silent guardian. "If not for you," she whispered, her voice breaking into the quiet hush of the porch, "we would have lost everything." Her words drifted across the yard, carried by the warm breeze, to where Cooper lay. His ears twitched, and he raised his head, turning to look back at her with eyes the color of autumn amber. In their depths glowed a wisdom older than words, a love purer than anything spoken aloud. Oliver giggled, leaning forward to press his forehead against Cooper's. "Mama says you're my angel," he whispered, his voice so soft it barely rose above the sigh of wind through the oak leaves. "Did you know that?" Cooper closed his eyes, leaning into the touch, his massive tail thumping once against the grass in quiet affirmation. He shifted his weight with a soft groan, his joints stiff from age and long days spent in silent vigilance. But when Oliver crawled forward to drape himself across Cooper's shoulders in a hug, the old dog curled his body closer, cradling the boy against his chest with infinite gentleness. From the porch, Lauren watched them through a haze of tears, her heart splitting wide with grief and gratitude all at once. She remembered the first day she had brought Oliver home from the hospital, the way Cooper had pressed his nose against the baby's tiny feet, with such reverence, his eyes wide and dark with silent promise. She remembered the night he broke down the laundry room door to save her son. She remembered his growls in the darkness, the deep primal fury that had protected them from the evil they had invited into their home. She remembered the days after, when Oliver lay in a hospital crib, pale and silent, and Cooper refused to leave his side, his golden fur matted with blood that wasn't his own. And now here he was, old, tired, breathing with slow, labored grace, but still keeping watch. Still holding the line between her son and the dark. A single sob broke loose from her chest. She pressed her hand to her lips, her shoulders shaking with silent weeping. Mama Oliver's voice rose in sudden delight, shattering the grief that had wrapped her like chains. "Mama, look, Cooper's smiling at me." Lauren laughed through her tears, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. She stepped down from the porch and walked barefoot across the grass, the clover cool and damp against her soles. As she approached, Oliver beamed up at her, his gap-toothed grin wide and bright. "I was reading him this bear story," he announced proudly. "He likes it. I'm sure he does. Sweetheart," Lauren murmured, sinking to her knees beside them. She reached out and buried her fingers in Cooper's fur, scratching gently behind his ear. His tail thumped once in quiet approval, his eyes half closing with pleasure. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, her voice cracking with love, so raw it trembled in her bones. "The best boy. Our hero." Cooper sighed deeply, his massive chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. He turned his head, pressing his nose into Oliver's chest, inhaling the warm, sweet scent of the boy he had protected since birth. In that single gesture, Lauren saw it all. The silent promise he had made the day they brought Oliver home. The fierce devotion that had driven him to attack a human to protect his family. The sleepless nights beside the hospital crib. The patient hours spent guiding Oliver's first steps across the therapy field. The hundreds of therapy dogs he had trained since then, each carrying a part of his gentle spirit into the world to heal what was broken. She saw his life. Quiet, humble, filled with acts of courage no one else would ever see. a life spent in service to others, asking nothing in return but love. The breeze shifted, rustling the oak leaves above them. Dappled light danced across Cooper's fur, highlighting the silver that frosted his muzzle, the darkening shadows beneath his eyes. Oliver curled against his side, laying his head on the old dog's chest. Cooper shifted, curling his massive body protectively around the boy, his eyes sliding closed in peaceful contentment. Lauren pressed her hand to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and silent. She knew with bone-deep certainty that this moment was one of those rare, perfect miracles in life. A snapshot of love so pure, it seared itself into her memory forever. The breeze carried the scent of clover and sun-warmed hay. In the distance, the therapy dogs barked and played in the paddock, their joyful cries mingling with the droning hum of cicadas. Lauren bent forward and pressed her forehead to Cooper's. His breath huffed against her skin, warm and damp, carrying the scent of earth and grass and something uniquely, deeply him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with grief and gratitude and love beyond measure. "Thank you for saving him, for saving us, for being our angel." Cooper's tail thumped once against the grass. He opened his eyes, fixing her with that deep, ancient gaze that held the silent wisdom of 1,000 unspoken promises. And in that moment, with the sun setting behind them and the world glowing in warm golden light, Lauren knew with absolute certainty that what they had was forever. The camera pulled back, rising slowly into the deepening dusk. The old oak stood tall and wide, its branches rustling in the fading breeze. Below it, a small boy lay curled against a golden dog, their bodies fused together in a tableau of perfect, unbreakable love. Lauren sat beside them, her hands tangled in Cooper's fur, her tears falling silently onto the grass. As the camera rose higher, the full sweep of Cooper's haven came into view, the therapy paddocks dotted with running dogs, the rescue barn glowing with warm light, the wooden playground David built the farmhouse, with its wide porch wrapped in honeysuckle vines. The sun slipped below the horizon, casting the entire sanctuary in a final blaze of crimson and gold. A soft piano melody rose beneath the sound of the breeze, slow and aching, carrying the emotion of the moment like wings. And then across the screen, in simple silent white letters, the final words faded in. "Sometimes angels don't have wings. They have 4 paws and a heart that never betrays." The music swelled, filling the fading light with warmth and hope. The final image lingered. Oliver sleeping against Cooper, the golden dog's eyes half closed in silent, eternal vigilance. And then the screen faded to black.